Hello, and welcome to Capsule Cooking. Today I'm going to show you a method for roasting pork shoulder. This method is very versatile and can be adapted for both wet sauces and dry spice mixes. I will give you a few ideas on flavoring, and I will cover some watchouts for when you try your own. I'll also cover methods to store, reheat, and use the pork in your daily meals. First, you will want to get a few bowls out to help you keep organized when cooking. One bowl for the fat and other scraps, and one bowl for each flavor you plan on using will be sufficient. We are going to use one small metal bowl and two larger bowls today. Pull out your pork. If it came in a plastic bag, pat it dry using a paper towel after draining. Trim the fat around the pork, focusing on the large pieces. Generally, cutting slowly will make this task easier, and it is better not to rush. Cutting away from you is always safer. For some of the hard to get pieces, trimming a small flap, grabbing it, and then slicing towards the area you are pulling can help. Keep trimming the fat to your preference. Our next step is cutting the pork down into slabs of around 1 inch. Do this with all the pork you are cooking, placing it into a bowl as you go. After you've cut all the pork, pull out each slab and cut it down into 1-inch strips. After you're done cutting your pieces, you can wash your hands and get any sauce, marinades, or rubs that you want to use. Today I will be using two of my personal favorites, a homemade char siu and a homemade rub. For dry rubs, you will want to use a neutral tasting cooking oil to help make everything stick. For syrupy and saucy marinades, pour the mix into the bowl and stir the pork. By hand is usually easiest. Wash out between flavors to prevent crossover. For the dry rubs, pour some oil and your spices over the meat and stir. Again, using your hands is preferred. After you're done, cover each bowl and place them in the fridge. You can marinate the pork for between 1 hour and 2 days, but overnight usually just about hits the spot. We typically batch cook our proteins on Saturday and will marinate and prep the meat the night before. When you are ready to cook your pork, preheat the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Pull the pork out of the fridge and get a few sheet pans with racks ready. How many pans you will need will depend on the size of the pork, and you will need 2 half-sheet pans for a pork shoulder of around 5 pounds. I'm using 2 quarter sheet pans today and will be doing 2 batches. Putting down some aluminum foil will make cleanup easier. Put the pork down on the rack, leaving a bit of space in between the pork pieces, and place the pork into the oven. Cook the pork for 15 minutes and pull it out of the oven. If you use the sauce for your marinade, I recommend using the leftover sauce from the bowl to baste the pieces on both sides. If you use the dry rub, use a diluted honey mixture to accomplish the same effect. Basting will give a bit more sweetness to the pieces and will help develop a darker char, but is not necessary. Make sure the pork pieces are flipped to a different side and put them back in the oven for another 15 minutes. Pull the pork out of the oven and repeat the basting process one more time and place the pork back into the oven for another 10 minutes. After this is done, the pork should be fully cooked and you can stop cooking here. If you prefer a bit more char, increase the oven temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, baste the pieces once more, and place them in the oven for another 5 minutes. Let the pork shoulder rest for about 15 to 20 minutes before slicing. If you are eating right away, tent the pork to prevent it from losing too much heat. If you are batch cooking, don't cover the pork and let it rest for about 30 minutes. For short-term storage, keep in a container in the fridge for up to 4 days. For longer-term storage, you have a few options. The best prep method for freezing is using a vacuum sealer. This limits freezer burn by limiting air exposure and lets you keep items frozen without drops in quality for the longest time. One option, if you don't have a vacuum sealer, is to use a Ziploc bag with a water bath to push out the air. This can be done by prepping a large water bath and dropping a Ziploc bag into it while keeping the top open. The water pushes the air out of the bottom of the bag as you go into the container and helps remove most of the air. You can also use a straw to suck out the air from a Ziploc bag. The trick here is to get as close to the food as possible to get the best seal and sucking in while pulling the straw out of the bag. Before I got a vacuum sealer, this was my go-to method. I recommend labeling for any of the methods you use using either a Sharpie or masking tape. To reheat the frozen pork, your best bet is to leave it in the fridge overnight. In my fridge, the pork will usually be fully thawed by noon the next day if I remember to put it in the night before. In general, I do not remember or don't plan that far ahead and will do a quick defrost the day of. You can defrost the meat a few hours ahead by putting it in a bowl of cold water or use a sous vide to do this quicker by circulating the cold water. Methods for reheating and preparing the pork will vary depending on what you will be putting it into. Most of the methods can be done with the meat still frozen if necessary, but will typically need longer to reheat and may not reheat as evenly. Chopping the meat can be difficult or dangerous when frozen as well and is not recommended. To reheat whole pieces, your best bet is an oven. 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 15 minutes will typically do the trick. For meals like stir fries, slicing the pork or dicing it into cubes will make preparation quick and easy. Sauteing the pork in a bit of oil until crispy will make for a nice end result. If you're going for a saucy application, adding a bit at the very end and taking the pan off heat will yield a nice coating on the meat. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about what the capsule cooking method is. The core of the capsule cooking method is to break down meals into 4 simple categories to make the process of putting a meal together simple in the moment. This allows me to eat a varied diet without having to plan in advance and without taking up too much time at lunch or dinner. The 4 components I break my meals down into are bases, proteins, nutrients, and flavors. Breaking meals down into these components and making sure every meal I have contains at least some of each group ensures that each meal covers my nutritional needs while allowing me to make on-the-fly recipes that end up tasting great. I prefer planning my meals like this instead of doing things like meal prepping or batch cooking because it allows me to prepare food based on how I feel in the moment. By breaking meals down into 4 categories and prepping each group separately, I still get most of the time savings of meal prepping without feeling stuck or getting bored with what I'm eating each day. Today, I will focus on the roast pork we just made and show you 3 different options for meals. One of my go-to meals is rice bowls. They are easy to make and require very little time. Most of the ingredients can be prepped ahead of time, and the proteins and rice can be cooked in batches and reheated in the microwave to save even more time. I typically start with the protein since this requires the most prep. Slice the defrosted pork into small bite-sized squares and reheat in a pan with a bit of oil. After the pork starts to get crispy, add your preferred flavors. I am using a teriyaki sauce, sesame seeds, and green onions. Keep heating the pan for another 30 seconds or so to make sure the meat gets coated and the flavors melt, and take off the heat. The prep for the rice is similar. I usually make about 3 cups of rice on Sunday, and my wife and I will eat that throughout the week. If you have fresh rice, use that, but if not, 90 seconds in the microwave will typically do the trick. Rice needs to be reheated a bit longer than you would think to make sure it has the right chew. For the nutrient category, I like to use vegetables. I try and keep some pre-prepped in the fridge ready to go. Today I'm using cabbage slaw, cucumbers, pickled peppers, and green onions. I picked these because they add a nice fresh crunch to the final dish and can all be served as is. At this point, you have your protein, base, and nutrients covered, and all you need is a flavor to bring everything together. For today, I'm using a homemade teriyaki sauce to add some flavor to the rice and vegetables, and topping with some sesame seeds. Another meal I like to make with this roast pork are tacos. For this, I start by heating up some corn tortillas in a dry or oiled pan. Heat each tortilla for around 30 seconds on each side and store on a plate covered in a clean cloth. To reduce dishes, you can use the same pan to cook your pork. Add a bit of oil to your pan and add sliced pork. Cook until crispy and add some cabbage slaw. Cook this for about a minute and add some barbecue sauce. Cook the mixture for about 30 seconds to thicken up the sauce and set aside. For assembly, place down a corn tortilla and add some of the pork cabbage mixture. Add the vegetables of your choice. I'm using microgreens and pickled peppers, and top with whatever flavors you would like. I'm using a cilantro lime sauce and Valentina hot sauce, but salsa or sour cream are also good options. The next dish I'm making with the roast pork is fresh spring rolls. Prep for this is very similar to the rice bowl, with a rice paper wrapper replacing the rice as a base. This works best with stronger flavor sauces being used as a dip. For the pork, heat it up with your preferred method and slice it into long strips to make it easier to roll. After this is done, set that aside and get the rest of the ingredients together. You have to work a bit quicker with this since the rice paper can be time sensitive, so it's best to pull everything out and have it ready to go before starting the next step. Get a shallow bowl or container of warm water and dip a single sheet of rice paper into it. Leave it in for about 10 to 15 seconds to soften up and then place onto a cutting board. Fill the roll with whatever ingredients you would like. I'm using carrots, red bell pepper, green onions, and microgreens. Be careful not to overfill since the rice paper can be delicate. Roll the rice paper by bringing the bottom edge up and pulling back to keep the fillings tight. Fold over your outside edges into the middle and finish rolling. It might take a few times to get the motion, but as long as the roll holds together, you're good to go. Serve this with a dipping sauce to bring it all together. I use a homemade stir-fry sauce that I keep in my standard rotation. Thank you for watching my video. Stop by next week for more methods and recipes. Feel free to leave any suggestions or ideas for more videos in the comments.